May 1st, 1863. The Army of Northern Virginia stands on the brink of annihilation. 60,000 hungry, half-supplied men are surrounded on three sides by an army more than twice their size. For 160 years, the story told about what happened next has been the same. Robert E. Lee, the master strategist, calmly split his army in the face of the enemy and won the most brilliant victory of his career. That story is true. It is also incomplete, because the men who wrote it down were not historians. They were Lee's own officers, and they had a reason to make sure nobody ever looked too closely at how close it came to going the other way. Chancellorsville sits in a stretch of tangled Virginia woodland known as the Wilderness, about 10 miles west of Fredericksburg. In the spring of 1863, it was a single crossroads in a two-story brick mansion owned by the Chancellor family. Nobody chose it because it mattered. It mattered because two armies collided there almost by accident, and one of them should have lost. The Union commander was Major General Joseph Hooker, a man history remembers mainly for his failure. That reputation is deserved in the end, but it wasn't earned overnight. Hooker took over the Army of the Potomac in January 1863 after the Fredericksburg disaster had gutted its morale, and by every measure he actually fixed it. He reorganized the supply system. He created a functioning cavalry corps. He built the Bureau of Military Information, the Union's first real intelligence operation, and he used it well. Hooker knew Lee's strength, knew Lee's dispositions, and knew that Lee's most experienced corps under James Longstreet was 200 miles away foraging for food in southeastern Virginia. Hooker called his army the finest on the planet, and for once the boast wasn't empty. He had roughly 130,000 men. Lee had barely 60,000. On paper, this was not a battle. It was a formality. Hooker's plan was good. He left part of his force at Fredericksburg to pin Lee in place and marched the rest of his army in a wide loop to cross the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers upstream, landing squarely on Lee's exposed flank. It worked. By April 30th, Union forces were assembled around Chancellorsville, sitting behind Lee's lines, and Lee did not know it yet. When Union General George Meade realized what had happened, he reportedly told his Corps commander Henry Slocum that they were on Lee's flank, and Lee had no idea. He was right. For about a day, the Army of Northern Virginia was in more danger than almost any other point in the war. Then Hooker stopped. Instead of pushing his advantage into the open ground east of Chancellorsville, where his numbers and his artillery would have overwhelmed the Confederates, Hooker pulled his forward divisions back into the wilderness and dug in around the crossroads. His own corps commanders objected. The terrain he retreated into was thick second-growth timber, choked with underbrush, where his artillery advantage meant nothing, and his numerical advantage was hard to bring to bear. Historians have argued for over a century about why he did it. Some blame a loss of nerve after early skirmishing rattled him. Some point to old drinking habits he'd supposedly sworn off. Whatever the cause, the decision handed Lee something he had no right to expect: a second chance. This is the part of the story that gets flattened into simple genius. Lee's next move is usually described as bold, visionary, the product of a brilliant tactical mind reading the battlefield perfectly. What actually happened was closer to a man staring down a losing hand and deciding that folding was worse than the risk of losing everything. Lee's army was already outnumbered more than 2-1. Now he chose to split it again. He left about 10,000 under Jubal Early to bluff an entire Union corps at Fredericksburg and took the rest west to face Hooker directly. That was gamble number one. On the night of May 1st, Lee met Stonewall Jackson at a fire in the woods near the intersection of the Orange Plank Road and the Furnace Road. Cavalry scouting under Fitzhugh Lee had found something extraordinary. The Union right flank, held by the 11th Corps, was simply not anchored on anything. No river, no ridge, no natural barrier. It was, as the officers put it at the time, hanging in the air. Lee and Jackson spent the night working out a plan that would have been rejected as reckless by nearly any other command team in American military history. Jackson would take nearly 30,000 men, more than half of what remained of Lee's already divided army, and march them 12 miles along narrow country roads around the entire Union position to fall on that exposed flank. Lee would stay behind with barely 14,000 men to face the bulk of Hooker's army alone. If Hooker had realized what was happening and struck Lee's remaining force before Jackson arrived, the Army of Northern Virginia would likely have been destroyed in a single afternoon. Even Lee's own artillery chief later admitted the plan defied the most basic military doctrine of the era, the same doctrine written out plainly by Clausewitz: never divide your force in front of a stronger enemy. Lee did it twice in 2 days. Jackson's march on May 2nd was not the flawless, invisible maneuver it's often described as. Union soldiers spotted the marching column multiple times through gaps in the trees. Federal General Daniel Sickles sent out a probing attack that briefly struck Jackson's rear near Catherine Furnace and captured part of a Georgia regiment before being driven off. Reports of Confederate infantry moving south reached Hooker's headquarters more than once that day. Hooker looked at the reports and decided Lee was retreating toward Richmond. He told his officers to let the Confederates go. It was, in hindsight, one of the worst tactical misreads by any Union commander in the entire war, and it is the single biggest reason Jackson's flank march worked. Not because it was undetectable, because the man receiving the warnings chose not to believe them. At around 5:30 in the evening, Jackson's men came out of the woods along the Orange Turnpike and hit the Union 11th Corps while many of its soldiers were literally cooking dinner, muskets stacked, no order to fight. The Corps, made up largely of German immigrant regiments who would be unfairly scapegoated for the collapse for decades afterward, broke almost immediately. It wasn't cowardice, it was an ambush executed against troops who had received repeated warnings and been told to ignore them by officers above their pay grade. The rout was real, and it was devastating, but framing it purely as a testament to Confederate brilliance erases just how badly the Union command had already failed before a single shot was fired on that flank. Then came the moment that turned a stunning victory into a permanent wound. After dark, with his men disorganized in the Black Timber and eager to push the advantage before Union forces could recover, Jackson rode forward past his own picket line with a handful of staff officers to scout the ground for a possible night attack. Returning through the darkness, his party was mistaken for Union cavalry from North Carolina infantry from his own corps. The soldiers opened fire. Jackson was hit 3 times. One of his own aides, screaming that they were firing on their own men, was met with disbelief from soldiers who assumed it was a trick, a piece of history that says something uncomfortable about how thin the line was that night between order and chaos. Jackson's left arm was amputated. He developed pneumonia in the days that followed and died on May 10th. Lee, on hearing the news, is recorded as saying that Jackson had lost his left arm, but he himself had lost his right. The battle didn't end with Jackson's wounding. It got worse before it got better for the Confederates. On May 3rd, Lee launched a series of brutal assaults to reunite his divided forces, in fighting so intense that the day ranks among the bloodiest single days of the entire war, trailing only Antietam in combined casualties. And while Lee was consolidating his position at the Chancellorsville crossroads, word reached him that Union General Sedgwick D had broken through the thin Confederate line at Fredericksburg, the line Lee had gambled with a fraction of his army, and was now marching directly toward Lee's rear. For a second time in 3 days, Lee's decision to divide an already outnumbered army had opened a door that could have ended the campaign in Union favor. Lee had to detach forces yet again, this time to deal with Sedgwick at Salem Church, splitting an army that by this point existed in 4 separate pieces, all of them individually outnumbered by the force in front of them. It worked. Sedgwick was checked and pushed back across the river, but the margin between greatest victory of the war and catastrophic destruction of the Army of Northern Virginia was thinner on those 4 days in early May than in almost any other campaign Lee ever fought. By May 6th, Hooker had withdrawn his entire army back across the Rappahannock, ending the campaign. The numbers alone tell you how strange the outcome was. A Union army of roughly 130,000 men had been beaten by a Confederate force less than half its size. Abraham Lincoln, on hearing the news, reportedly could only repeat, my God, what will the country say?" Confederate casualties, however, were proportionally worse than Union losses. and the death of Jackson alone would prove more costly to the Confederacy's long-term prospects than almost any single battlefield loss of the war. Lee had won, but he had also just demonstrated in the span of 5 days exactly how little separated his army from complete destruction, and exactly how dependent his victories were on a Union commander who kept declining to press every advantage handed to him. There's another detail usually left out of the highlight reel version of this battle, and it matters because it explains why Lee was gambling in the first place. 2 months earlier, Lee had detached his most experienced corps commander, James Longstreet, along with 2 full divisions, and sent them southeast to forage for food and supplies around Suffolk, Virginia. That decision had nothing to do with strategy against Hooker. It was about survival. The Army of Northern Virginia was starving. Lee's quartermasters couldn't feed the men he had, let alone the ones he needed for a major fight. And Longstreet's foraging expedition was meant to buy time and supplies for exactly this kind of confrontation. The result was that Lee walked into the single most dangerous week of his command career, missing roughly 15,000 of his most seasoned troops, commanded by the general Lee trusted more than almost anyone else in his army. Longstreet did not arrive in time to take part in the battle at all. That absence is rarely mentioned in the version of the story built around Lee's genius, because it complicates the narrative. It's much simpler to say a great commander won a great victory than to say a hungry army's best corps was 200 miles away scrounging for bacon and flour, while its commander improvised a series of moves that could easily have ended in disaster. It's also worth sitting with how thin the Confederate position actually was during Jackson's march. While nearly 30,000 men filed off into the woods to the west, Lee kept the remaining pieces of his army stretched across more than 3 miles of front, deliberately staging skirmishes and probing attacks to convince Hooker that a much larger force was still opposite him. It was a bluff, plain and simple, run against an army that outnumbered the bluffing side by a wide margin at that specific point on the field. Confederate officers who wrote home in the weeks after the battle described the tension of that day candidly, aware that a determined push by any part of Hooker's army could have rolled straight through Lee's thin line and reached Jackson's rear before the flank attack ever developed. That tension doesn't survive in most retellings, because retellings built around inevitability don't have room for the version where everything nearly falls apart. The rout of the 11th Corps deserves one more honest look, because the way it's remembered did real damage to real people. In the years after the war, the collapse of Howard's Corps became shorthand in Southern accounts for Union cowardice, and the German-American soldiers who made up much of that command bore the brunt of the blame in print for decades, mocked in cartoons and dismissed in memoirs as the men who ran. What actually happened is that an entire corps was hit from a direction its own commanders had been warned about repeatedly and told not to worry over. Their collapse wasn't a referendum on their courage, it was the predictable outcome of superiors ignoring scouting reports for most of an afternoon. That distinction mattered to the men who lived through it, and mattered to their families for a generation afterward. And it's one more thread the post-war mythmakers were happy to leave tangled, because a story about Union cowardice served the lost cause narrative better than a story about Union command failure. This is where the second, quieter story begins, because what happened to the memory of Chancellorsville after the war is arguably more revealing than the battle itself. Lee died in October 1870. Almost immediately, a coordinated effort began among his former subordinates to shape how he would be remembered. And the man leading that effort was Jubal Early, the same general who had held the thin line at Fredericksburg during the battle. Early became the driving force behind the Southern Historical Society, founded in 1869 and later based in Richmond, which published its own journal specifically to control the historical record of the war from a Confederate point of view. Early's central project, pursued for the rest of his life, was building the idea of Lee's total infallibility. Any battlefield failure, from Gettysburg back through the earlier campaigns, had to be explained as someone else's fault. His most frequent target was James Longstreet, who had the added misfortune of joining the Republican Party after the war, making him an easy and politically convenient scapegoat for a movement that needed its villains to be reconstructed traitors as much as failed generals. What's notable is what happened before Early got to work. In the years immediately following the war, Southern writers were actually willing to criticize Lee. Edward Pollardy, who coined the term lost cause in his book of the same name in 1866, argued that Lee's overall influence on Confederate fortunes had been mixed at best. Early critics pointed to real tactical missteps at Malvern Hill, at Gettysburg, even in aspects of the otherwise successful 7 Days campaign. Chancellorsville in this earlier window was still described honestly by people who had been there, as an audacious gamble that had worked, not as evidence of some untouchable genius. That honest window closed fast. Once Early and the Southern Historical Society got control of the narrative pipeline, deciding which veteran accounts got published and which quietly disappeared, the story hardened into something closer to scripture. By the 1880s, articles in the Southern Historical Society papers were making the claim that Lee had essentially never lost a battle he was allowed to fight on his own terms, an idea that simply does not survive contact with the actual record of Gettysburg, Antietam, or the final Overland campaign, let alone the sheer number of near catastrophes buried inside his supposed masterpiece at Chancellorsville. Early's approach worked because he controlled the pipeline. Veterans who wanted their own accounts of the war published often had to go through the Southern Historical Society papers, which meant Early and his allies effectively decided which memories survived into print and which quietly disappeared. Accounts that praised Lee's boldness at Chancellorsville, while still noting how badly things could have gone, gradually were replaced by accounts that treated every decision as flawless from the outset. By the time Lee had been dead a decade, the idea that he had ever taken a genuine risk, as opposed to executing a foreseen and controlled maneuver, had mostly disappeared from the popular record. Southern newspapers as early as 1868 were describing Lee in language usually reserved for religious figures, and that tone only intensified once Early's machine got to work in earnest during the 1870s and 1880s. Douglas Southall Freeman's Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Lee, published in the 1930s, cemented the image for the 20th century, presenting Lee as something closer to a secular saint than a battlefield commander who took enormous risks because his army's manpower situation left him no better options. Historian Thomas Connolly later described this constructed version of Lee as the Marble Man, a figure so scrubbed of personality, doubt, and error that he stopped being a person and became a monument standing in for an entire regional identity after defeat. Jackson received the same treatment almost immediately after his death in 1863, remembered by Lost Cause writers less as a general who had gambled with more than half of his commander's army in a maneuver that could have ended in disaster, and more as a flawless, deeply religious martyr whose death was simply tragic, rather than the predictable outcome of riding unannounced past your own nervous pickets in pitch darkness. None of this means Chancellorsville wasn't a genuine tactical achievement. It was. Dividing an outnumbered army twice in 3 days and still winning is one of the most audacious sequences of decisions in American military history, and serious historians have never disputed that. What the post-war myth machine did was strip away the parts of the story that made Lee look human. The fact that his opponent handed him the battle by losing his nerve at the exact moment he held every advantage. The fact that Jackson's famous flank march was spotted multiple times and only succeeded because Hooker refused to believe his own scouts. The fact that his own subordinate was killed by his own soldiers in a mistake that had nothing to do with enemy action. And the fact that on at least 2 separate occasions during those 5 days, a slightly more aggressive Union response could have ended the Army of Northern Virginia's ability to fight altogether. Visitors to the battlefield today, and readers of the earliest Southern Historical Society accounts, have described a Chancellorsville stripped almost entirely of its uncertainty, a battle where every decision looks inevitable in hindsight, because the men writing the history had spent the following 50 years making sure it would. The real story of Chancellorsville isn't that Robert E. Lee was infallible. It's that he was willing to accept catastrophic risk because the alternative was almost certain defeat. And that risk paid off largely because of decisions made by the man across the field from him. That's not a lesser story. It's a more honest one. And honestly, it's a better one, because it puts the tension back into a battle that a century of polishing had sanded flat. And it's the one that a small group of former Confederate officers spent the rest of their lives making sure the country would forget. If you want to understand how the Confederacy lost the war, but won the memory of it for the better part of a century, Chancellorsville isn't a footnote to that story. It's where the pattern started. And once you see it here, you start seeing it in every battle that came after.